Welcome back to Homo Non Grata, the series that shows and tells how America's gay people weathered the Cold War. The post-war years saw a lot of changes in the American way of life, and as always, college students took the lead in setting new social trends, especially where sex was concerned. The old men who ran the colleges not so much, especially where sex was concerned. Today we'll see what happened when the University of Wisconsin discovered a handful of gay men on and around campus. It's one of those stories that's been mentioned here and there, but it seems nobody's ever bothered to dig in and take a look at what really happened. Till now. This is Chapter 4, A Nest of Homosexuals, Wisconsin's Big Men on Campus. On June 8, 1948, police detectives appeared on the doorstep of a house at 1514 Adams Street in Madison, Wisconsin. In the course of a 2-hour-long search, they confiscated what was described as a huge supply of obscene literature and other evidence indicating unnatural sexual activities. 47-year-old Arnold Meyer and 26-year-old Carl Boyd were arrested on charges of sodomy and possession of obscene materials, consisting of books, pictures, and a large box of personal letters. The Wisconsin State Journal reported with a barely concealed wink to its readers that the room where the officers found most of the smut was lavishly decorated in an oriental motif and contained expensive-appearing incense burners and perfume atomizers. To post-war American sensibilities, anything Asian reeked of depravity, effeminacy, and opium. Further investigation aimed to reveal the place was used as a den where a number of men gathered to engage in illicit sex. The Adams Street house was a short walk from Camp Randall Stadium and the University of Wisconsin campus. The district attorney's office had coordinated with university police in gathering the evidence that led to the raid. Several more arrests were expected, both on campus and off. Homosexuality on college campuses was a hot topic even before the Cold War began. In November of 1944, University of Texas President Homer Rainey had suddenly been fired by the state's Board of Regents on the grounds that he hadn't moved quickly enough to weed out a nest of homosexuals. Rainey had called in the state police for an investigation of immoral conduct on his campus, ultimately leading to the removal of 10 faculty members and 15 students. The board members took offense because they'd been left out of the loop. More recently, just 12 days before the raid on the Meyer home, Professor Emory K. Johnston of the University of Missouri had been accused of leading a ring and hosting mad homosexual parties that drew up to 30 men at a time to his Columbia home and a vacation cabin in the mountains. Arrested with him were a university student, a U.S. Veterans Administration employee, and Johnston's housemate and partner of 15 years. The entire group was believed to consist of as many as 48 men, the majority of them students. Johnston was fired from his faculty position by the university's board of curators even before a preliminary hearing had been held, for reasons deemed completely sufficient. College students were commonly seen as impressionable children, highly susceptible to the evils of communism and sexual perversion. People like Rainey and Johnston, it was feared, could erase 18 years of good upbringing and parental supervision in the blink of an eye. In Madison, Meyer and Boyd, though not directly connected to the university, were considered by their very presence in the city to pose a dire threat to the morals of young men. Arnold Meyer had grown up in Madison as a member of a pioneering Dane County family. The youngest of 6 siblings, he was still living with his parents at age 24 when they moved into the new house on Adams Street, a 4-bedroom place with an attached rental unit in the rear that was often leased to college students. 2 years later, his father passed away, and Meyer remained in the house with his mother, Anna. He was named general manager of the company where he'd been working since age 19, a heating contractor whose long list of clients included local high schools and churches, retail stores, apartment buildings, and the University of Wisconsin. Meyer married in June of 1928, about the same time he'd been chosen to run the company. He and his wife shared the Adams Street home with his mother. They lived a comfortable life, often taking pleasure trips around the country. They had no children. Carl Boyd grew up working in his father's bakery, first in Fort Scott, Kansas, and then at a new shop when the family moved to Jefferson City, Missouri. His father passed away in 1940. Barely 18 years old, Boyd ran the shop with his stepmother until the Army drafted him in September of 1942. The shop closed its doors the next spring when his stepmother's health failed. She passed away 4 months later. Boyd had married a childhood friend from Fort Scott shortly after he entered the service. In March of 1944, while he was serving as an aerial gunner in the Army Air Corps, she gave birth to a daughter who couldn't plausibly be his. The pair split up. His ex-wife quickly remarried, and Boyd was released from the service at the end of November 1945, a single man. With nothing left to hold him in either Missouri or Kansas, he moved to Wisconsin for a fresh start, intending to use his GI benefits to enroll at the university. On March 1, 1946, he became Arnold Meyer's new tenant at the Adams Street house in Madison. Within a few months, Meyer and his wife were divorced. It seems Boyd's arrival had made quite an impact on the household. The investigation into the private lives of Meyer and Boyd had begun when 19-year-old Don Aston, a student of cosmetology at a Madison beauty culture school, was discovered by police in a parked car with another man. He was booked for lewd behavior and not sodomy, which suggests not much more than making out or heavy petting was going on, at least as far as the arresting officer could see. Taken before Judge Roy Proctor at a John Doe hearing to protect the secrecy of the coming investigation, Aston produced a letter from Meyer inviting him to stop by Boyd's apartment to look at obscene pictures and for whatever else might happen. The judge immediately issued a search warrant. Detectives showed up on the Meyer doorstep the same night. Within 3 days, 10 men in addition to Meyer and Boyd had been arrested. 6 were charged with sodomy and 4, including Aston, with disorderly conduct. Less serious than lewd behavior, this was a catch-all misdemeanor often used by prosecutors when no criminal act had been committed, but the defendant had done something they didn't approve of, like making out with a guy in a parked car. One of the men was a 36-year-old Madison native who worked on campus at a shop in the Memorial Union building. One was a 17-year-old Central High student who was quickly sent off to juvenile authorities out of public view. 6 were war veterans. 7 were current or recent students at the University of Wisconsin. Most of those were involved with the school's theater groups, either the Wisconsin Players or the Haresfoot Society, an all-male troupe that was famed for its musical productions with men in drag playing the female roles. They regularly took their shows on the road and collected rave reviews around the state. A late-night drinking party after a Haresfoot rehearsal had figured into several of the charges. Some residents of relatively liberal Madison were outraged by the arrests. 5 days after the news broke, the Capital Times printed an angry letter that blasted the police for conducting a witch hunt spawned by nothing more than filthy postcards and dirty stories. Reminiscent of Hollywood's Psychiatrist, the letter was signed by a doctor who compared the raid to the excesses of the Inquisition and the purges of Nazism and chastised the police for ignoring recent scientific data on homosexuality. Must homosexuals go on being treated in this day and age as if they were common criminals? How can intelligent citizens of the state and city stand by silently and see reasonableness and justice made a mockery in the hands of prosecutors and muckrakers? It is incredible that hunting down and trapping homosexuals, making game of them, and then displaying them like freaks or wild animals in the public arena should be so patently a business of our supposedly enlightened city government. 2 days later, another letter was printed from a reader who felt a doctor didn't go far enough in laying blame. Signed Disappointed in Capital Times Integrity, the letter reserved the harshest criticism for Madison's 2 daily papers, not only for treating the matter as a juicy piece of news, but for publishing the name and address of each man arrested. As a medical student told me yesterday, the newspapers seldom if ever print the names of people committed to mental hospitals. Those men picked up were also sick. Any doctor will verify that. Why make pornographic journalism out of their lives? The reader had a point. There was clearly a double standard in play. The men had not been charged with any crime aside from those committed consensually and with each other. And while today it's repugnant to hear gay men described as mentally ill, that in itself was a big step up from being cast as dangerous criminals. Kinsey's report notwithstanding, in 1948 it was simply not possible to suggest in a mainstream newspaper that homosexuals were normal in their own way and should be left alone to find happiness with their own kind. If the Capital Times received any letters praising the police action, the editors didn't consider them worthy of print. The Wisconsin State Journal maintained a neutral stance. They eagerly reported each new development of the case in lurid detail, but kept the matter off the editorial page entirely. 4 of the university students pleaded guilty to the sodomy charges and were brought before Judge Proctor for sentencing. 3 of them were represented by counsel. Larry Board's attorney warmed up the room by announcing, "I realize it is a crime which cannot be condoned and has effects and repercussions so terrific it has the whole city talking." He claimed his client, who'd been awarded his degree in February but was still performing on stage in Haresfoot productions, had taken part in only 2 or 3 isolated acts and was not a part of the proceedings which had been going on at the university for some time, an indication it was common knowledge that such activities on campus were neither new nor rare. Lyle Dine, another Haresfoot member, was conceded by his attorney to have displayed a certain element of the psychopathic in his actions, but was not in need of treatment and presented no threat to society. Paul Power's attorney argued the 18-year-old freshman had already been punished enough. Like Dine, he'd been expelled from the university and was kicked out of his fraternity as well. Carl Soderberg had suddenly been dropped from the university rolls just 2 weeks before the raid on the Meyer house. He was one of the first to be arrested and told investigators he'd had sexual contact with 5 men since March of the previous year. 4 of them were arrested shortly thereafter on the basis of his testimony. The 5th he couldn't identify because the man had given him a false name. Soderberg appeared in court without an attorney and offered no explanation, either for his sexual conduct or for ratting on his 4 friends. Assistant District Attorney Glenn Henry, who led the investigation, argued the 4 should be treated equally. None were any more or less guilty than the others. What they'd done was by mutual agreement, and no one was forced into anything. Judge Proctor gave a nod to Kinsey's report by acknowledging some would have us believe that abnormal sexual behavior is natural and normal biologically, but reminded them under the current statutes he was bound to punish them as wrongdoers. The penalty for sodomy in Wisconsin was 1 to 5 years in prison, much lighter than many other states, but still a harsh sentence for men who are only behaving among themselves according to their nature. The judge suspended the sentences of all 4 men, gave them 1 year's probation, and released them with a scathing lecture. Each and all of you should feel deeply ashamed. You have embarrassed your friends and relatives, none of whom I am sure had the slightest idea you ever could or would become involved as you have. Each of you by your conduct has caused an indelible mark to be placed against you. Certainly you will have to watch your step in the future, not only to avoid becoming second offenders, but to allay all suspicions of your becoming involved again. I assure you that on any second offense, this court and any other court will not be as lenient as this court has been today. While the penalties he handed out were light, his personal feelings in the matter, dutifully reported by the press, had been made abundantly clear. 2 other men had entered pleas of not guilty to sodomy charges. Both prosecutor and judge agreed that a sodomy case would be very hard to win with neither a confession nor the testimony of an impartial witness. The men were offered the chance to plead guilty to a disorderly conduct charge, avoiding the possibility of a felony conviction and prison time. Each was fined $100, the maximum amount for the offense. It was the same fine already levied on Don Aston for his backseat activities. That left only 2 more disorderly conduct cases to deal with. Both men were graduating seniors. While each had already completed his classwork and exams, the university's Board of Regents chose to refrain from awarding their degrees until they'd heard the judgment of the court. Gilbert Tank, 26, was a native of Kenosha, an auto industry center on the Lake Michigan shore, about 35 miles south of Milwaukee. He graduated from a 1-year business course at the Kenosha College of Commerce before the war, and served with a medical unit of the Army beginning in August of 1942. Afterward, he worked toward a degree in marketing at the university and was accepted for membership in Alpha Delta Sigma, a national honor society sponsored by the American Advertising Federation. His service in the military had been abruptly cut short in 1943 for reasons that were not publicized but suddenly crystallized in the minds of many. Kenneth Palmer, 27, had grown up in Edgerton, a small town 30 miles southeast of Madison. He'd been a university student and a Haresfoot member before the war and was called up for service at about the same time as Tank. Palmer attained the rank of lieutenant in the Army Air Corps and served as navigator with a B-24 crew, making over 50 bombing runs on targets in Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and the Balkans. He returned to Wisconsin in September of 1945 to finish his degree in business administration, rejoined the Haresfoot Society, and was named vice president in charge of production. He always appeared on stage in female roles, just as he'd done before the war, and was singled out in reviews as a graceful dancer. Palmer had more than a disorderly conduct charge and a college degree to worry about. He was also engaged to be married in 3 weeks' time. At first he'd entered a plea of not guilty, but in court was changed to no contest. His attorney made the most of Palmer's military record and impending wedding, arguing he was different from the others and not a mental case. He claimed Palmer was misled by another man and his judgment had been clouded by heavy drinking due to overwork on the Haresfoot rehearsals, pulling out the old "I was drunk" excuse, a standard alibi for sexual misconduct ever since Lot in the book of Genesis knocked up his 2 virgin daughters. In the end, even the prosecutor was swayed to remark that his was an ordinary disorderly conduct case which happened to come to light at a time when other parties were charged with more serious offenses. If Judge Proctor bought that story, it didn't seem to matter. Both Palmer and Tank were levied the now standard fines of $100. But the regents seemed to be paying attention. Palmer's degree was awarded and his wedding went off as planned. He moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to take a job with a manufacturing firm. Tank's diploma was withheld. The regents would finally award his degree a year and a half later, in January of 1950. Despite all the media attention given to university students, Haresfoot parties, and diplomas, Meyer and Boyd were still seen as the central figures in the drama. They went to trial on September 29, 1948. As with the others who had entered not guilty pleas, the district attorney's office decided to drop the sodomy charges, since there was neither evidence nor witness testimony that any sexual activity had occurred between them. The charge of possessing obscene material was impossible to dispute. The men pleaded no contest. At the prosecutor's suggestion, Judge Alvin Rice viewed samples of the confiscated pornography, 5 pictures that had been hand-drawn by Boyd. 22 more with similar content were said to be in the hands of police, along with some photo negatives of an obscene nature, presumably nude shots of Meyer and Boyd and possibly others, and a handful of letters that had been written by the two. The obscene material taken in the raid was said by the prosecutor to be quite voluminous and reported by the Capital Times as consisting of 3 albums and several boxes. The evidence described to the court for the purpose of aiding the judge in passing sentence was hardly enough to fill a single shoebox. Whatever may have comprised the bulk of the alleged pornography, it seems to have been no more sensational than Boyd's own artwork, a few racy letters, and some photos that were not clearly described, but in any case were not explicit enough to support a charge of sodomy. And yet it was a crime the district attorney's office felt compelled to prosecute. Attitudes toward pornography in the post-war era were extremely puritanical. Anything that was created for the purpose of stimulating sexual desire was considered obscene. Anything not fit to be seen or read or heard by young children was scorned as a disgrace to society. This doctrine, aggressively enforced at federal, state, and local levels, was presented very clearly 7 years later at the 1955 hearings on pornography conducted by the Senate Subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency. Chairman Estes Kefauver, Democratic senator from Tennessee, opened the proceedings by reading a statement from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The publication and distribution of salacious material is a peculiarly vicious evil. The destruction of moral character caused by it among young people cannot be overestimated. The circulation of periodicals containing such material plays an important part in the development of crime among the youth of our country. A number of expert witnesses at the Senate hearings testified to the harmful effects of obscene material. Dr. Benjamin Cartman, chief psychotherapist at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., the nation's first federal institution for the mentally ill, stated there was a very direct relationship between juvenile delinquency, sex life, and pornographic literature, and claimed that viewing scenes of abnormal behavior could cause a boy to become gay. Roy Blick, head of the Vice Squad at the Washington Metropolitan Police Department, agreed that pornography is causing kids who are just at the age that they should know right from wrong to become perverts and homosexuals. He called the problem more dangerous than narcotics because each piece of obscene literature could be passed from one kid to another. There was no doubt in his mind that many assaults, rapes, and sex crimes had resulted from viewing dirty pictures. Recent studies have found the opposite to be true. As pornography has become more readily available on the internet, the rate of sexual assaults has gone down, particularly in countries where porn was outlawed for several decades. Of course, in the 1940s, it was a popular notion even among some mental health professionals that masturbation led to psychological instability. Today, a doctorate is not required to reach the conclusion that the lack of masturbation is much more likely to lead to mental stress and erratic behavior. Testimony before the Senate subcommittee left no doubt that the porn available in the post-war era would also be labeled as porn today, although some, but certainly not all of it, would now be legal. Photos, movies, comic books, and literary descriptions of sexual acts involving men, women, teenagers, children, and animals. All of these were sold through nationwide black market networks, by peddlers on the street or under the counter at otherwise legitimate bookstores. This was the material targeted by the hearing. But the expert witnesses also voiced great disdain for what they termed borderline pornography, material that wasn't obscene by federal guidelines but was not made for any other purpose except to arouse the sexual passion of a person. Called out by name was Bob Miser's Physique Pictorial, a quarterly magazine sold openly on newsstands, containing photos of nearly naked athletic men in artistic poses. It was wildly popular with its target gay male audience. Prosecutors at all levels often pursued obscenity charges on this type of material, knowing full well it didn't qualify as obscene, as a means of running the so-called pornographers out of business. In Madison, the reluctance of the district attorney to describe the bulk of the material confiscated in the raid on the home of Meyer and Boyd suggests it's likely that in large part the men's collection was of the borderline variety. Wisconsin's obscenity law was among the toughest in the nation. The penalty was a fine of $100 to $5,000, or 3 months to 5 years in jail, the same maximum term as for a sodomy conviction, no matter whether the offender was a major porn distributor or an individual who drew dirty pictures for his own amusement. Dane County prosecutor Glenn Henry recommended a fine of $1,000, equivalent to about $12,000 today, for each defendant, which happened to be the amount they'd posted as bail. At the urging of Meyer's defense attorney, a former city alderman and wartime Army officer who Judge Rice respectfully addressed as Colonel, the fine was set at $300 apiece. The judge refrained from ending the proceeding with a moralistic sermon as his colleague had. By law, all of the confiscated material was destroyed, with no legal determination aside from the word of police and prosecutors that it was legitimately obscene. The justices of the Dane County Court had exercised a certain amount of leniency in their handling of the 11 convicted men. They'd felt it necessary to punish them, but spared them any penalty that would have had a serious impact on their lives. The district attorney's office showed no such restraint. 8 had been charged with sodomy, though the prosecutors knew full well they didn't have the evidence even to support a single case. They banked on the men confessing to their crimes out of intimidation and shame, and the 4 who did so would needlessly bear the label of felony sex offender for the rest of their lives. Their action exposed a deep-seated aversion to anything that strayed from normal, particularly where sex was concerned, a repugnance felt so strongly they'd sacrifice legal integrity and ignore the basic obligations of their job. This was the crux of the problem faced by the gay community in the early post-war years. The very idea of homosexuality was foreign and frightening to many. The knee-jerk response across the board was to make every effort to squash it quickly and wipe it out, like some new species of large and hairy spider that had just been discovered spinning webs and laying eggs in the pantry. Carl Boyd was hired as a bookkeeper at Arnold Meyer's heating company. He occasionally dusted off his baking skills to create a special wedding cake for the marriage of friends. When Meyer's mother died in 1950, Boyd moved from his rental unit into the main house. The two lived there together until Meyer passed away at age 72 in 1974. Well, that's it for today. Next time, we'll see how a small town found something legitimately wrong going on and launched into a brutal overreaction without ever stopping to get the whole story. This is one that hasn't been documented anywhere before. Even the newspapers back in the day didn't have all the facts. It's one you aren't going to hear about anywhere else. Don't miss it.